At the start of World War II, France fell. In a quiet seaside town, a reserved young girl named Jean lived with her grandfather, relying on each other for survival. Though war had arrived, life still seemed to carry on in calm and quiet. But the arrival of an enemy captain would soon shatter that fragile peace. The captain ordered Jean to vacate one of the rooms, to prepare it for a newly assigned officer. Girl of delicate age, Jean could only imagine what such a request might lead to, and the thought of the incoming officer filled her with dread and disgust. But as one of the conquered, she had no choice but to obey, and it seemed no coincidence that the enemy chose the very room once belonging to Jean's parents. Her mother and father had both been victims of this senseless, repulsive war. For years, Jean had kept that room pristine, preserving every memory of them. Now, even that sacred space was about to be trampled under the boots of the enemy. The idea filled her with hatred, yet as a powerless civilian under occupation, she could do nothing. Winter in France was bleak and bitterly cold, and even gathering around the fireplace could not drive away the chill. After dinner, Jean would sit at the piano, just as she always did, and play Bach's prelude. The notes flowed through the room like a gentle spring, so pure that even the flickering fire seemed to sway along with the music. But neither she nor her grandfather realized that a military truck was slowly approaching the house. Perhaps the melody was so beautiful, so haunting, that it stopped the officer in his tracks. He stood still at the door, completely entranced by the dreamlike tune. After waiting a while, he held his breath and gently pushed the door open, careful not to disturb the peaceful moment inside. But the instant Werner's silhouette appeared in the doorway, the piano fell silent. Jean froze, her heart tightening as she turned in fear, bracing herself for what punishment might follow. But the officer was not the rough brute she had imagined. He was a soft-spoken, humble gentleman. In fluent French, he apologized sincerely for his sudden intrusion. Speaking with great respect and care, he explained that he was only following orders to stay here. Otherwise, he would never have dared disturb them. Despite his explanation and polite apology, Jean and her grandfather remained silent. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and the officer could only accept their silent protest. After touring Jean's parents' room, Werner expressed his satisfaction. He tried to thank Jean with genuine appreciation, but she answered his gratitude with a cold, resounding rejection, slamming the door behind her, leaving only silence in the room. Despite her frosty demeanor and the clear resistance from the household, Werner showed no anger. In fact, he seemed entirely unbothered by their distant attitude. Every day, he continued to greet them with politeness, saying goodbye in the morning, and good night upon returning. During moments of quiet, he would even deliver heartfelt little speeches, thanking them for letting him stay. And yet, every time Werner spoke, his eyes would quietly drift toward Jean. His gaze held a mix of nervousness and confusion, yet within it shimmered a clarity, a brightness that couldn't be ignored. His joy seemed to express itself only through the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his lips. But no matter how passionate or eloquent Werner's words became, the grandfather and granddaughter remained utterly unresponsive. After Werner went upstairs, the grandfather, making sure he was out of sight, asked Jean to play a Bach prelude, hoping the music might ease the heavy atmosphere in the house. But Jean refused without hesitation. Her voice was firm and unwavering. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, they're all German, she said. As long as Werner is here, I won't play a single note. The next day, while Werner was away, Jean went into town to buy supplies. But when she returned, she found her bicycle had been stolen. With no other choice, she had to walk all the way home. The long journey left her feet blistered and bleeding, the pain and exhaustion forcing her to sit down and rest. It was then that Werner happened to pass by. He stopped and, with sincerity, offered her a ride in his car. Perhaps it was the searing pain in her feet that momentarily quieted the hatred and stubbornness inside her. After a pause, Jean picked up her bundle and began walking toward Werner. He smiled gently and opened the car door, ready to welcome the proud young woman. But Jean walked right past the vehicle. Pride and dignity weren't reserved for victors. Even those from a defeated nation could still hold firm to their inner strength and unyielding spirit. Werner quietly followed behind her, silently taking in the look of defiance on her face. Realizing Jean would not get in, he gestured for his driver to leave. That night, Werner changed out of uniform, came downstairs in plain clothes, and gently knocked on their door. He said, "My room is very cold, and if you don't mind, I'd like to warm myself by the fire for a while." As always, the grandfather and Jean remained silent, offering no reply. But Werner seemed to read a quiet permission in that silence. He took a seat by the fireplace and began to speak. He shared that his own parents had died in the war, that though he hated war, He had been born into a family where tradition demanded he wear the uniform. He revealed that he was actually a composer, and soon his words turned to music, to Bach. As he spoke, you could hear not the voice of a soldier, but the soul of a man who loved art and cherished life, a man who seemed to have nothing to do with war at all. Throughout his monologue, Werner's eyes never left Jean. From the initial brightness to a deepening sorrow, something in him shifted. Perhaps, in a different world, without war and hatred, they could have been kindred spirits, even friends. As Jean listened to his heartfelt confession, she couldn't help but feel a strange, unfamiliar tension welling up inside. It was an emotion hard to name, yet it quietly shortened the distance between them. The next day, Jean happened to witness a neighbor's child fall to the ground. Werner rushed over immediately, gently picked up the boy, and whispered something softly in his ear. Watching this, Jean once again felt that Werner was different. He seemed to truly despise war. He seemed genuinely kind. Jean quickly found the little boy and asked what Werner had said to him.
C'était pas grave.
That sentence deeply moved Jean. She couldn't help but begin to reflect on the light of humanity that seemed to radiate from Werner. Night fell, but Jean couldn't sleep. Something stirred within her as if she were waiting, hoping for someone to arrive. Even as her grandfather drifted off into slumber, Jean was willing to break her own vow and play the piano again, just to hold onto this fleeting moment. Suddenly, footsteps echoed outside the door. Her heartbeat quickened in an instant. She sat up straight, and the performance she had prepared was temporarily set aside. She felt both nervous and expectant. Werner slowly approached the warmth of the fireplace and began another quiet monologue. He spoke of the sea not far away, vast and beautiful, stretching endlessly into the sky. He said he loved the sea for its calm, not the calm you see on the surface, but the kind that hides a surge of currents beneath, deep and mysterious. As he spoke, his gaze once again drifted toward Jean. She dared not meet his eyes, but inside, a flood of powerful emotions surged like a rising tide. After Werner left, Jean exhaled deeply as if a heavy weight had lifted. Tears glistened at the corners of her eyes, a mix of fear, confusion, and inner struggle. The restrained storm of emotions left her shaken. From that day forward, Jean began to care more about her appearance, and each evening, her heart held a strange, quiet anticipation. She started to glance at him in secret, noticing how sharp and upright he looked in his Nazi uniform, how striking his profile appeared beneath that gray officer's cap. As time passed, her gaze shifted from cold and distant to warm and tender, from bitter hostility to dazed affection. On Christmas Day, Jean wore her mother's most beautiful dress and sat down to a warm dinner with her grandfather. Just then, Werner walked in, disrupting the peaceful moment. Startled, Jean quickly grabbed her napkin, but when she heard he had only come to change clothes and would soon leave, she subconsciously relaxed her grip. Her thoughts were transparent, her emotions drifting like a buoy at sea, pushed and pulled by waves, swaying between distance and closeness. In that brief intersection, their emotions clashed beneath the surface like hidden undercurrents in the ocean, touching, then parting again. Later, her grandfather left to attend a prayer gathering with a friend, leaving Jean and Werner alone in the house. When they met in the small room, Werner hesitated at first, then slowly approached but only dared to rest his hand lightly on the back of the chair, afraid to disturb the fragile balance between them. Then he moved toward the piano, gently lifting the cover. He said Bach was his favorite composer too, and quietly took a seat. Jean gave no response, she didn't even look at him. Suddenly, the music began. She closed her eyes, letting herself be pulled into it. The notes burst forth like a thunderstorm, emotional waves pouring out like a flood. And yet, the melody remained clear and pure as a stream, eventually flowing into a vast ocean and fading into silence. The power of music pierced through the walls between them. The frozen distance began to melt like an iceberg dissolving into warm, deep waters. Werner stared at Jean as she leaned against the sofa, a strange impulse rising in his chest. He couldn't resist. He walked closer, drawn by the golden hue of her hair, by the softness of her pale, delicate skin. His hand, pulled forward by emotion, reached out instinctively. Jean remained silent, but in the end, his hand paused in midair. He hesitated, afraid to destroy the stillness between them. Werner turned and left quickly, leaving only a quiet Merry Christmas before disappearing into the night. After he left, Jean, almost without thinking, entered his room. She gently ran her fingers over the scarf he often wore, breathing in its lingering scent. Unable to stop herself, she opened his letters, wanting to know more about the man who had stirred her so deeply. Finally, she buried her face in his pillow, silently soaking in his presence. But Jean's heart was torn. On one side was the hatred born of war, the painful reminder of national grief, of identity, of loyalty. On the other was a young woman's sincere affection, an undeniable longing that burned quietly inside. With that unmelting block of ice lodged in her chest, she fell into a restless sleep. Caught in contradiction, no one knew how much time had passed when a car engine startled her awake. In a panic, she rushed to put the letters back in place, but a sudden gust of wind from the door gently blew one to the floor. At that moment, Werner's hurried footsteps approached from the stairs. He seemed to hear a faint noise at Jean's door. Instinct told him to push the door open, but just as his hand touched the wood, he hesitated. In the end, he chose to walk away, and behind the door, Jean longed for him to step inside, yet trembled at the very thought. But this wasn't merely a door between them. It separated not just two young souls caught in a world at war, but two entirely different worlds destined never to meet. Back in his room, Werner soon discovered the fallen letter. A wave of complex emotion rose in his chest. He realized that perhaps Jean, too, had been struggling with the same feelings, seeking an answer in his heart. The next day, he waited for her at the bridge while she went to the market to buy fish. When Werner appeared in Jean's view, she paused for a moment, then lowered her head anxiously and continued walking. He stood there, hoping she might stop, hoping for a real conversation face to face. But as she drew closer, the distance between them closing, until his boots stood squarely in her path, no words were exchanged. The air was thick with an unspoken tension. Suddenly, Jean's basket slipped, and the fish spilled onto the ground. Werner instinctively reached out to help, but strangely, each time their hands moved, they narrowly avoided each other as if guided by some invisible force. Werner's gaze never left Jean's face. In a brief glance they finally shared. He saw it, the confirmation of everything he felt. Then Jean turned and walked away. He said nothing. He only smiled quietly, watching her go. Because in a time shrouded by war, love that begins is love that must end in tragedy. And so, they buried it deep in their hearts. That evening, Jean made a shocking discovery. Her revolutionary neighbors had planted a bomb beneath a military vehicle. She panicked. Her first instinct was to rush upstairs and warn Werner, but as she stood outside his door, she hesitated. On one side was loyalty to her country, the call of duty to resist. On the other, her conflicted emotions, her first innocent love. She couldn't decide. Her breath grew heavy as she struggled against herself. Which was the right choice? Caught in a storm of confusion, she spent the night in sleepless turmoil. At dawn, when she saw two enemy officers getting into the vehicle, the anxiety returned full force. Her pupils shrank in fear, and she turned to look back again and again, silently praying that he wouldn't be among them. Her heart was in agony, torn between two powerful forces, but she knew she had to act. She ran to the piano. Her fingers leapt across the keys, playing a frantic Bach prelude. The urgent melody reached Werner just in time, pulling him from the grip of death. He turned in surprise toward the music, still wearing his gentle, courteous expression. But this Bach, this wasn't the music he knew. It beat like a storm against his soul. He noticed the fear and shock in Jean's eyes. Her lips trembled, as if to speak, but nothing came. He tried to understand her warning. Then came the deafening blast outside the window. The walls shook. Jean felt both relief and lingering fear. Werner stood frozen, then dashed outside. Two of his comrades lay lifeless, through the rising smoke. He never forgot the one who had saved him. The neighbors were quickly arrested by the military. Their fate was grim. Jean, heart heavy with guilt, took in their young child, but a part of her still held hope that perhaps Werner could use his position to save them. When she rushed to the execution site, all she found were cold-faced soldiers with raised rifles. Among the crowd, Werner saw her, through her eyes, full of desperation and pleading. He understood everything she wished she could say, but he was just an officer, powerless against the crushing weight of authority. All he could do was turn away in silence. Their eyes met one last time, and then parted. That evening, Werner was uncharacteristically quiet. He didn't go to the sitting room. He simply packed his bags. He had planned to leave without a word, but the grandfather called out, asking him to wait a moment. Turning back, he stood before them and gently explained. He was being sent to the Russian front, a place of ice and fire, a battlefield of iron and blood. In his final goodbye, his voice trembled slightly, and in that moment, it felt like he had returned to the day they first met. Jean watched him in silence. Her heart ached. There had never been anything spoken, no bond declared, yet emotion surged like a tide between them. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, catching the light, reflecting the sorrow buried in his heart. As his final goodbye echoed softly in the room, Jean could no longer hold back. She stumbled after him, each step unsteady, yet determined. Moving toward the departing car, Werner stepped down, meeting her halfway. His feelings spilled through his gaze alone, her thousand unspoken words caught in her throat until at last, she whispered a single word, goodbye. It was the first thing she had ever said to him, and the last. He was a gentleman, graceful, composed. She was a lady, gentle, dignified. They said nothing more, but between them, emotions flowed like a quiet stream, their eyes holding each other in a final, tender glance. Yet in the face of war, love was powerless. Even a simple embrace was a luxury beyond reach. His heart was a raging sea, but only Jean would ever know. He turned and stepped into the car, vanishing into the darkness. She stood facing away, silently seeing him off, his voice echoing in her ears until even that last whisper faded into the cold night. A girl's first love, a noble man's affection. It should have been a beautiful tale of destined hearts, but fate, so cruel, pulled them apart. Nation and loyalty, humanity and dignity, duty and sacrifice. These lofty ideals stood like towering walls between them, keeping pure love forever out of reach. In the end, they were both forced to choose between love and responsibility, and I can't put into words the look in Werner's eyes as they parted, a gaze full of longing, of deep, unshakable love, of heartbreaking restraint. Even if he were to fall someday on the frozen fields of Russia, even if he disappeared into a shadowy execution chamber, in that final moment of life he would still be haunted by the sound of Bach's prelude echoing from Jean's piano. That extreme restraint, those words never spoken, that love buried deep within a war-torn world, all of it would drift silently into the ocean, for the silent sea carries the fiercest emotions, hiding love in its darkest corners, until it sinks quietly, like a memory, into the stillness of the deep. I'm a movie enthusiast. Thanks for watching. See you next time.